Welcome to the Free Pod. I'm here with Thea, Faye, author and freelancer. Hi.
Hello.
I'm so excited that you're joining me today. Just super happy that you reached out as well when I put that post out there of like, can you help me? I need help. So tell us, share with us, what is your connection with autism?
Well, when my oldest son is 18, and when he was 2, we emigrated to New Zealand. So we went, we lived in the UK and we went to the other side of the planet. So we literally turned his world upside down. And his reaction to that was really extreme. And it was quite unfortunate, actually, because he'd been in a Montessori nursery in the UK. So we'd put him into a Montessori nursery in New Zealand to try and give him a bit of consistency. And what we didn't know is that actually Montessori is a brand rather than a universal philosophy. And some Montessori places are great and some aren't. And unfortunately for my son, we went for one of the ones that wasn't. And he'd been identified as gifted in the UK already. And, we'd given all this information to the kindergarten. And after he'd been there, I think about 6 months, I got told by the principal that they wanted to have him assessed because they thought he was backward. Like, well, no, my child's gifted. you know that he's gifted. And they're like, well, he's not, and he has these like ridiculous tantrums, and they're really over the top, and it's all terrible and awful, and your son needs help. So we were like, okay, we can't leave him in this environment. And we pulled him out. And when we got all of his notes and stuff, his work that he'd been doing, it really explained a lot about why they've been having problems with him, because the whole point about Montessori is that it's child-led. And that's what I love about it, because I take a very child-led approach to my parenting. And what they were doing in this place is that instead of letting him do what he naturally wanted to do, which is the Montessori way, they'd be like, no, you can't play with those things until you've shown us that you can like sweep with a little broom on your tray. And he was just like, well, I don't want to do that. So no, I'm not going to do that. So they were like, he's got no attention. It's like, well, no, he doesn't want to do the things he doesn't want to do, but he can sit there for an hour if it's something he finds interesting. So we pulled him out. And by that point, his behavior was very explosive, very over the top. By that point, I was about 6 months pregnant with my third child, because I got pregnant pretty much as soon as we got to New Zealand, because my husband had been there first for a couple of months and we missed each other. So baby number 3 was on the way. And we had also, there's my oldest daughter. So my oldest son was 3, my oldest daughter was 2, and baby number 3 was on the way. And we took him to an educational psychologist that we'd been referred to, because we were like, well, we're not going to get him assessed for being backward because we know he's not, but we'll get him assessed for being gifted because we know he is. And yes, he was gifted. And she said to us, give him 6 months because he's been in a very unsuitable environment, and see how he does. And if things haven't changed in 6 months, you might want to consider getting him assessed for autism. So that's when I started looking into what autism was, because I'd heard about it, but I didn't really understand any, I didn't know what it was. It was a word, and that was about as far as it went. And so I started looking into it and going, okay. And 6 months on, we were still in a position where I couldn't take him where there were any other children because he would hit them. It was, it made that first year in New Zealand incredibly difficult, because like my plan for like building my social network had been, well, I'm a mum. You go and see other mums with small children. You bond over the fact you have small children. That's it. Bingo. I have friends. And instead, I was like, yeah, we'll go to the playground, but we'll only go when I know that everybody else is at school and we'll have it to ourselves. We'll go to the pool at times when I know it's empty and we can be in the pool by ourselves. We'll go to the cinema on days when I know that it's empty, so we can be by ourselves. So he was assessed and he was diagnosed, yes, his high functioning autism. So because we were in New Zealand, we were lucky enough to get that diagnosis, because I know that if we stayed in the UK, we wouldn't have been able to. And I actually don't know if we would have started our autism journey if we'd stayed in the UK, because I look back and there were certain little things in his behaviour that, you know, were signs it was there. If you know what you're looking for, you could see it in him, you know, from a very, very early stage. But because we planned on home educating anyway, his behaviours never would have been problematic enough to need diagnosing, or, you know, it would have just been, well, you know, he's just being a boy, that just is what it is. And we might not have got him diagnosed at all, or if we had, it probably wouldn't have been until he was relatively old. So, you know, it's kind of one of those mixed blessings, really, that going did cause him a lot of harm. It made things very difficult for all of us, but at the same time, we got a diagnosis. And because we had that diagnosis in New Zealand, they give you a lot of support in the early years. So he had speech language therapy because he could talk, but he didn't really want to. I remember once a friend of ours, her dad used to volunteer to drive the trams at the Museum of Transport. And so she said, hey, look, we'll go and spend the day at the museum. My dad drives the trams. We can get you in for free. You can, you know, come behind the scenes and just sit on the trams, all this kind of stuff. So we did. I remember we sat on the trams that first time for about an hour and a half, just going up and down this tram track. My son loved it. And we had lunch with my friend's dad. And he was sitting with my son and, like, clearly sort of wanting to get some kind of excitement from him, because my son was very, you know, you have to know him really well to know if he's excited about something, because he just doesn't show it. Even now at 18, he doesn't show if he's excited about stuff. And I remember Alan saying to my son, so you're having a good time? Yep. Do you like the trams? Yep. You don't say much, do you? Nope. You know, he was like, I don't talk unless I've got something I want to say. But the speech language therapist was really good because she helped with his communication. And by that point, it was also clear that there were issues with my oldest daughter that were completely different issues, but again, there was something not quite right there. So with her, she was diagnosed as being on the spectrum when she was 2. And the pediatrician who diagnosed her said to me, autism isn't quite the right fit, but yes, there's definitely something here. So I will give you the label so you can access support and we'll figure it out later, because it's clear that she does need some intervention. And she was subsequently diagnosed as being dyspraxic when she was 4. And then later it became clear she was dyslexic. She was formally diagnosed dyslexic when she was 12. We're now absolutely convinced she also has dysgraphia and dyscalculia. Like, she has like a gazillion learning disabilities, but she's also, the way that she talks about it's hilarious. She says that she imagines herself before she was born, like sort of with the person that decides what life you're going to have in your next life. And her saying to like the person, you know, right, I want to be really creative. Okay, we can make you creative, but you're going to have to be autistic. That's fine. I want to be more creative. Okay, we're going to have to give you dyslexia then to counter it out. Yes, more creative. And like actively going, no, give all my stuff to the creative side, and I'll take the disabilities. I don't care. And it actually makes perfect sense if you know her. It completely explains everything. So I had 2 children diagnosed. And when my 3rd child was born, my oldest has actually been a very straightforward baby, very easy to care for baby. But when we'd gone to New Zealand, had become incredibly hard work. My oldest daughter was hard work from the moment she was born. She was very much, there's mama, and everything else is not the mama. And up until she was 18 months, she wouldn't take a hug from anybody, including my husband, if I was there. Like, she just wouldn't. And she was so connected to me that, like, she could be asleep and I'd just nip out to the shops. And apparently the second I'd leave, she'd start crying. And as soon as I came back, she'd stop. As soon as she had me, she'd stop. So she was very, very sensitive, and very, very connected to me, which is a beautiful thing, but also very hard work. So when child number 3 was born, it was like, they say that, you know, if you've got one child with autism, it's highly unlikely you'll get a second. So for me having 2, I just, you know, got unlucky. And I remember speaking to the speech therapist about child number 3 and saying, well, you know, is this one going to be on the spectrum as well? And she was just like, no, she's fine. She's got good eye contact. And that's, you know, and she's starting to babble and stuff. She's fine. Yeah. Child number 3 was an angel until she was 18 months. She then hit her terrible 2s and is only just starting to come out of them now. She's 14.
Wow.
So Skylar is a force of nature. There is a specific subset of autism called oppositional defiance disorder. Skylar is a textbook example of that. She's, you know, she's got a soft, gooey center. She's actually very, very sensitive, but dear gods, you would not know it to actually speak to her or be around her. Love her to bits. She's going to take over the world one day, but very, 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 very definitely on the spectrum. But that, you know, that didn't become clear until she was older, and just, she did not grow out of this, the terrible 2s stage. It just kept going. So yeah, if there was anybody that was just not going to do what they're told, it would be Skylar. If you told Skylar not to do something, she would do it. You know, Skylar loves, she's even said once, like, a direct Skylar quote, I like being naughty because it's fun. And like, to sum her up, like, there was one time I went to, I can't remember where I'd gone. I was only away, I think, for a day maybe, and my husband was in charge. Now, you know, I was full-time parent for years and years and years before I started writing. So the children were used to me being there all the time. So from one perspective, me going away for the day, of course, something was going to go wrong. But Skylar decided she was going to hide. And she was going to hide so successfully that my husband actually rang the police because he couldn't find her. I think she was about 4 or 5 at the time. She was not old, and she was always really tiny for her age as well. So he rang the police, and so they started looking for her. And apparently they were this close to bringing in the helicopters to start scouring the area when he did one more round of the garden, and he spotted her hiding underneath a shed in the garden. Like, it was like on a slightly elevated surface, and he saw her, and she stayed there watching them. And it wasn't that she was afraid of getting punished when she came out. She just thought it was hilarious watching these people looking for her. So that was child number 3, who doesn't have a diagnosis, because for a child who loves chaos and disorder, she wants to go into the army. You know, she's considering it, which is, we're all like, yeah, I can't see that happening. But we're respecting her wanting to keep her options open. But we all know that if we wanted a diagnosis for Skylar, we would get a diagnosis for her. So I had these 3 children on the spectrum where I didn't know that they were on the spectrum. Like, when I was pregnant with number 4, I actually didn't know. So I ended up with 4 children without actually realizing that I had all these, you know, autistic beings in my life. And so then child number 4 was born, and she's my blonde-haired, grey-eyed child. All my others have my colour, and they're all, you know, dark hair, dark eyes. But she's blonde, these gorgeous big grey eyes, left-handed where all the others are right-handed. We joke she's our genetic throwback. She's our 1 in 4 chance of having the blonde. And she's the polar opposite of Skylar. Like, could not be more different. Where Skylar's about chaos, Robin's about order and following the rules. And, you know, she gets very, very stressed when people don't follow the rules. If a sign says stay off the grass And so like Skylar would deliberately put a foot on the grass, and then Robin would have a complete meltdown because the rules are you don't step on the grass, and she wouldn't be able to cope with that. So from a parenting perspective, she was awesome because she didn't have a terrible twos phase. She toilet trained herself. Like all the others have been nightmares. She did it herself. And she spoke very early. She was walking very early and very, very compliant. So like, great, we've got one that's fine. And yeah, no, and then she started growing up. And again, it was just, it wasn't that she was a problem in terms of, you know, sort of parenting, but I could see her struggles because out of all of my children, she was the one that most desperately wanted lots and lots of friends and thrived being around people and, you know, sought people out and wanted to be around people, but really struggled to build connections, really struggled to cope with the chaos, really struggled to cope with the unpredictability of children, struggled to cope with the noise levels and all these things. I'd started looking, I think when she was about 5 or 6, and I'd been sort of watching her behavior, you know, for a few years, I started sort of putting 2 and 2 together and going, yeah, I think we've actually got another one that's on the spectrum. So she wasn't diagnosed until last year. And the only reason she's diagnosed, because my attitude is a label is only helpful if it's helpful. So when we were in New Zealand, diagnosing the older 2 made perfect sense because it got us help that we needed. Coming back to the UK, there was no point in diagnosing number 3 because they've all been home educated. She wasn't in school. She didn't need support in school. Yes, she's clearly autistic, but getting a label wasn't going to change our reality. So we didn't. Robin wanted to go to school and she kept asking to go to school. And, you know, I'm child-led. I'm happy to do what is right for each individual child. I also knew that if I put her into a state school, she would drown. It would not work for her. She would go from being, you know, quite a happy, laid back person to being a stress head who would come home in tears every day because why was nobody doing what the teacher told them to do? Like, how can they not do that? So we've been lucky enough for the past couple of years to put her into a private school. She has a bursary which helps with her school fees. And she's incredibly academically gifted. She's functioning 3-4 years above her age. She's 12, but she's doing, you know, exams that they would be normally be doing at 16 because she is ridiculously intelligent. And we really want to get some help with the school fees. So that's why we started the diagnosis process for her, was just for her, she wants to be in school. School works for her to a certain extent because where she's at, they are very small class sizes. It is very child-led, but even there, she is still having the problems that I said that she would have if she went to a mainstream school. So we are lucky that she's in an environment where they are supportive and understanding. And if she needs to be off by herself, that's absolutely fine. And nobody's going to bat an eyelid. And if she needs to be working with the older children, she can work with the older children, and that's fine. So they can really tailor to her needs. But even within that environment, she is struggling. So yes, if you can hear the shouting in the background, she's one of those. So she was diagnosed last year. And then my youngest was born just before I left New Zealand and came back home. He was 10 weeks when I came back. And so by this point, I have 4 autistic children. And I'm like, yeah, and he was, again, I keep saying that my babies were absolute angels apart from Summer. Even Summer was angelic as long as you held her, as long as I held her all the time. But Felix was awesome and sweetheart. And it was interesting because they say that autism doesn't really manifest until they're 5 or 6. Well, with all of mine before him, you could actually see it in them much, much younger than that. But with Felix, he actually was fine until he was about 5 or 6. which I think had a lot to do with being just such an autism friendly household and having things set up to support the autistic way of being. And then he started having these explosive bursts of temper. He became very aggressive. He couldn't cope with people. He desperately wanted to make friends, but couldn't cope with noise or people or unpredictability. And he was having some, sort of quite serious mental health struggles, like at 8, because Felix is a ridiculously deep thinker. If you have conversations with him, he's very emotionally naive in some ways, but in other ways, he has these really deep, profound thoughts that he'll come out with something and you're like, you're 10, no 10-year-old thinks about the world that way, but he does. So again, he's a very sensitive soul. And so we had him diagnosed to try and get some support for his mental health, which we got the diagnosis, we didn't get the support, but oh well, 1 out of 2 is not bad. And we figure I've worked with him and I've looked at other ways of supporting him. And then finally, because there's a lot of us in our household, my husband was diagnosed 5 years ago now. He was diagnosed when he was 50.
Wow.
Because he was having a few issues, and it was just like, well, look, maybe you're on the spectrum, so let's go find out. And it was just like, yep, textbook. So my husband is on the spectrum. And then I was referred for diagnosis as well. So I'm just still on the waiting list. So I haven't been formally diagnosed, but from what I've learned about my children, and like my 4th child, the one that's very, very compliant, is personality wise exactly what I was like at that age. So if she's on the spectrum, I am definitely on the spectrum. So there's basically, we're a household of 7. Every single one of us is autistic, and every single one of us is a unique individual, where I think the only commonality between our personalities is that everybody's really strong-willed. So it makes for a lot of fun.
Oh man. Wow. That's that's a lot of the spectrum going. Yeah,
Yeah,
like you have the whole spectrum in the house there, but it's cool. It's a beautiful thing too, because like you one of the misconceptions you actually mentioned before we got into that question is that that people think it's the same. Like everybody that has autism has the same exact symptoms and signs and personality. And I'm glad that you pointed that out with your kids. Like you could hear that each one is on the spectrum, but they're not the same. Like they have the different personalities with that. And I wanted to, I guess, ask more with what are more misconceptions you see, especially since you have a lot of knowledge base with the 7 of you. What are other misconceptions that you see with autism?
Well, I mean, I can tell you there's a couple of things that used to really annoy me when my children were younger. And one would be when you'd mention that your children were on the spectrum, you get the response, well, we're all a little bit on the spectrum. And it's like, yeah, no. There is a reason why it is called a disability and not just a personality trait. Because, I mean, the way that I describe it is that there isn't anything in autism that isn't in the human condition. Yes, there is nothing in an autistic person's behavior that somebody else might not have a similar personality trait or, behavioral thing. So, for example, stimming, which is like sort of repetitive body movements for self-soothing. A neurotypical person might have a little physical thing that they do that they find calming when they're under stress. Maybe they'll focus on their breath, but that's not quite the same sort of as an involuntary flapping of the hands or rocking backwards and forwards and not being able to stop. The same as a tantrum versus a meltdown. On the surface they look the same, but the actual underlying mechanism is very, very different. So a child having a tantrum can be reasoned out of it. They can be bribed out of it. They can be ignored out of it. An autistic meltdown cannot be stopped. It just has to be allowed to run its course. And it's going to be triggered by something that is very, very logical to that autistic person, but can seem like it comes out of nowhere to a neurotypical person or somebody who doesn't know that autistic child well. So, for example, with my oldest, he was very aggressive. He would hit a lot. So, we just didn't go to anywhere where there were other children when we were trying to work on that and actually get him to be okay about being other people without hitting them. But I could be out with him and I could be, which I would, I always like to give my children space. I'm not a parent. I will let my children go off in the playground by themselves and, climb. But I would always have half an eye on him, and I could always spot when he was about to hit somebody. I could always see it building up, so I could intervene before it actually happened. Somebody else watching that same situation would say it came out of nowhere. It was unprovoked. And that is actually not true. And it's the same with my youngest child, who didn't display that kind of behavior until he was quite a lot older. But we go to a home education camp every year when there isn't a pandemic. And he would go there and he loves the camp and he loves being around people. But there, you have a broad range of people there, and some of them aren't as nice. And there would be some children who would spot that Felix is a great person to wind up because his meltdowns are very, very amusing if you are the kind of person who gets pleasure out of watching somebody else screech and scream and be completely out of control. And unfortunately, some children do love that. And what would happen to Felix is that somebody else would wind him up and he would retain enough common sense to know that if I hit that person, they're bigger than me and I'll get hurt. So he would look for the nearest smaller person and hit them because he needed to get it out somehow, but he didn't want to be hurt any more than he already was. And so, I would get irate parents coming to me saying, your child, because I think he was okay. And then no, they go, your child is beating up my toddler. Your child is bullying my toddler. And it's like, no, he's not a bully. He's actually one of the sweetest person you would want to meet. And it isn't personal to your child. It is really unfortunate that your child is the one who just happened to be there. But it's actually because he is being bullied himself. And he needs to release that tension because he feels like he's going to explode. And right now, the only way he knows how to get that out is with his fists, which is something that we've done a lot of work together to find healthier ways of letting that frustration out. But again, with a neurotypical child, you can reason them out of that. You can teach them a better way much faster and more effectively. And, you'd get people going, what's the punishment for your child having done something? It's like, well, he's autistic. Punishment is not going to make any logical sense to them if, an hour after something's happened, because that's the first time you find out about it, somebody says to you, your child has done that, so what consequences are you going to do? Well, it's like, if it's not at the time, it's a little bit like training a puppy. If you don't, not that I'm saying that my children are feral animals, but if you don't, do something about the negative behavior at the time that it is happening, there is no logical connection. So my later, taking a favorite toy away because you hit that kid this morning, that's not going to stop him hitting that kid the next day if he's in a similar situation. Whereas with a neurotypical child, you can say to them, well, you did that, so this is going to happen. And they'll go, oh, okay. They might grump about it. They might, do the same thing the next day out of spite. But they'll be able to make those connections where with an autistic person, like with Seth, what we would need to do with him was if he hit somebody, immediately remove him from the situation. At kindergarten, he had one-on-one support and he had this specific spot that he would be sat on. If he hit somebody, he was immediately removed from whatever it was they were doing and he would sit in that spot. And it got him to a space where he could recognize that if he hit, he was going to be removed from whatever fun stuff was going on. So he got to a point where he could actually remove himself. He got to a point, and that was one of the things as well with my autistic children, is that, you know, people think that autistic people aren't particularly self-aware. My experience is that they are some of the most self-aware people you could ever possibly meet. And where you have some who behave in sort of a way that isn't considered to be societally acceptable, you know, maybe they're rude, you know, that they're abrupt or they're sarcastic or whatever, it's because they have actually made a logical choice that it actually doesn't benefit them to behave in a different way, therefore they don't need to. So with Seth, he became a lot more emotionally aware of his triggers at a very, very early age, because he was being taught to be aware of when you feel yourself getting wound up, you remove yourself from that situation and calm yourself down. And he actually has, you know, became very, very good at doing that at a much more sophisticated level than other children his same age. And that's one of the things I think with autistic people, is that innate sense of personal logic. Now, it might not be a logic that makes sense to other people, but it's an internal logic that has very well-defined rules that make complete sense when you understand how an autistic mind works. And I remember I was at a presentation about a parenting course that I didn't manage to do in the end. And they told us the story about a kid who was being toilet trained, and he'd get hysterical whenever he had to do a poo. And they couldn't figure out why he was so hysterical about going to the toilet and doing a poo. And one day it was just somebody managed to realize that he was stressed about what happened when the toilet flushed. So when he did a poo the next time, they like put him in the car, drove down, went to like the nearest water treatment plant. Apparently just so happened that by the time they got, it was dark or whatever, like all the lights were on. So they're like, look, they've got all the lights on to welcome your poo. And apparently from that moment on, the child never stressed about his poo ever again. And she finished telling the story by saying, we couldn't, you know, nobody can figure out why it is that this made a difference to him, but it did. And I just went, well, that's perfectly logical. He was really worried because that was part of him. And he was just like stressed about what happened to that thing that had been inside him that was part of him. He wanted to make sure it was being looked after. And now he knows it's being looked after. He's not worrying anymore. But that to me was obvious and logical. And yet, you know, these experts, neurotypical experts, hadn't been able to figure it out. And I think that was possibly sort of one of the earliest times when I began to start realizing that, I mean, I've always known I think differently to other people, but where I began to start thinking, oh, I'm probably on the spectrum as well, was because I remember looking at the other parents on this course and they were completely just distraught. You could tell these were people that couldn't connect with their children, didn't have a clue how to connect with their children, found it incredibly difficult. Whereas for me, although my son's behavior was incredibly challenging and made it very difficult because I couldn't make friends. I'm in a new foreign country and don't know anybody, and I can't get to know anybody. At the same time, I understood where he was coming from. I knew why things made sense to him because they made sense to me. So it was like, well, my brain works the way that my children's brain works, and it's logical. And what quite often happens, particularly in autistic females, is that we start off behind everybody else in terms of our understanding of how social mores work, because we don't pick it up by osmosis. So whereas a neurotypical child will naturally go through all the stages of development of play and how they learn to play, and you can predict roughly when a neurotypical child is going to gain a new social skill, because that's how the process works. With an autistic person, what we do is we learn the rules. We observe other people's behavior and we go, oh, when I do X, Y happens. And you build up this bank of information, and it's obviously incredibly complex, but you gradually learn the consequences of everything that you do. So you can actually predict much more effectively how people are going to react to whatever it is that you do, which then eventually results in you having a much better understanding of how people tick than a neurotypical person, because a neurotypical person can't explain the rules of engagement to you. They just know how they work. They know what the right thing is to do, but they can't explain why. An autistic person can explain why, and they can also tell you why it is they do or don't follow that rule, because they'll have made a conscious decision whether that rule makes sense to them or not, or whether it's worth following. And my youngest daughter has frequently said to me that I am the kindest person that she knows. And my response to that has always been, well, you just don't know enough people, my child. But I have also said to her that it's actually a conscious choice, because I don't feel like I'm an innately kind person. You know, I can actually be incredibly cruel, but I have over the years observed that being cruel to somebody does not serve me. It doesn't make me happy. It doesn't solve problems. It doesn't improve relationships or communications. Kindness does. So it is just, it's the logical choice to be kind. And that's not to say it's not sincere, because it's completely sincere and it's completely genuine and it's completely, you know, who I am. But it also is a choice of, well, if in a situation I can, you know, if a child has an accident, I can have a go at them for it, or I can pick them up, give them a hug, say, hey, accidents happen. What can we do to make sure that it doesn't happen again? They're both valid ways of dealing with the situation, but the one that's going to get me the better result, the one that's going to build a better relationship, the one that's going to support the child to make better decisions in the future, is the kind reaction. So it just comes down to logic. But, you know, and which I think as well, and again, that's another misconception, is it makes it sound like autistic people aren't, you know, they're not emotional, or, you know, they don't feel compassion, or, you know, they have like a bit missing. And it's not true. It's the exact opposite. Like with my middle daughter, who, as I say, she's the force of chaos, that actually comes because she's incredibly sensitive, and she's so terrified of people not accepting her for who she is, or not liking her, or not being good enough, that she would rather sabotage a relationship, you know, sabotage a friendship before it has a chance to get to anything, because then they haven't rejected her. And I've said to her before about, you know, why is it that you are so loud? And she's like, well, actually, I can't stand noise. So I'm really loud because I'm hoping that other people will realize how unpleasant it is to be around somebody really noisy and up, you know. So with her, there's a lot going on beneath the surface. And again, it's that logical thing. When you actually talk to her and find out where she's coming from, there is a reason behind everything that she does. But if you don't take the time out to uncover that reason, it will seem really illogical and coming from nowhere, and it just won't make sense to a neurotypical person, because a neurotypical person wouldn't make the choices that she does, because they don't fit in with how society likes to do things. And neurotypical people pretty much like to blend in with the crowd. They like to, it's a big generalization, but the average person likes to fit in, doesn't want to stand out, wants to have friends, community, large groups of people. An autistic person might want that, they might not. It depends if it's logical for them. And that's the big difference.
Well, I definitely appreciate you sharing that with me and everyone that listens, because there's a lot that I learned from you that that I didn't even know, about it. So I think that it's it's just interesting how the minds are between a neuro, which I'm horrible at saying the word, but the neuro mind and the the spectrum mind. Like it's interesting how different they are. But it's I when you talk about how it's also logical, the way that you explained it, like with that little boy, like the way you explained it made sense. It's like, oh, okay, that would make sense that he would be nervous and like, where is this thing going? Because we don't, like, from the neuro side, we don't think like that. We maybe some, I can't speak for everybody, but we don't always think like that. So when you explained it to us, it's cool to kind of be an outsider looking in and being like, okay, but that logically actually does make sense if you look at it. It's like, okay. But it is sad though that the experts there were kind of shocked by that. That kind of makes me sad that that was the experts. Like, what? Um, but with this, what advice would you give? Um, I'd say for other parents and other people that are that are on the spectrum, and then also maybe advice on, like, for us neuro people, like with understanding, or if does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. I mean, it's interesting now because what I've noticed is that like calls to like I actually have a lot of autistic friends, and a friend of mine, she was diagnosed I think a couple of years ago, and she's younger than me. She's in sort of her mid-30s, but I remember when she said that she was on the waiting list to be diagnosed, and my husband said to me, but she's not on the spectrum, she's perfectly normal. And I said, yes, by our standards, to us, she's perfectly normal. She's on the spectrum, dear. She is like us. So I think the thing is that if you're on the spectrum, or you think you might be on the spectrum, there's actually a lot more of us adults than is actually recognized, because obviously we're the generation where it was only just starting to be picked up on. And even now, I'm in touch with some of my teachers from school, and they'll be like, yeah, you were always different to the other kids, but you were just a bit different. Like, even now they're like, oh no, well, I don't think you were autistic, you were just weird. But I think also as well is that it is manifesting more severely in like the next generation. So like my oldest son is definitely more autistic than my husband or myself. Not to an extent that he won't be able to live independently, because he completely will. But out of all of us, he's the one that's got like the largest dose of autism. These are words. This is the problem. It's all words, because like in theory, we're all high functioning, but there's a reason why they're actually doing away with the term high functioning autism, because really that label's useful for society, because what it means is we can function within society without causing anybody else too much trouble. That doesn't mean that we're not struggling. And there are certain things that I really struggle with that, as an adult, they don't impact on my life, because I can make choices that mean that I can avoid situations that are difficult for me, or I can do things that really benefit me. Like one of the things that the pandemic has shown me is that actually I love interaction with other people way more than I ever thought I did. And people say that, autistic children, they don't need friends, they don't care, that they'll struggle to make friends, but it'll be okay because they won't care about it. And I was told that about my oldest, that he'd struggle, but he wouldn't care. That turned out not to be true. And actually, yes, he does care, but no, he hasn't struggled. So, it's all worked out. But yeah, if you're on the spectrum, or you think you are, look around, because the chances are very high that you actually already know other people on the spectrum, or if they're not on the spectrum, they'll be neurodiverse in some other way, because that's a really, really common thing, that just neurodiverse people who aren't slap bang in the middle of the bell curve, those of us who are at the edges, we naturally gravitate towards each other. And there's a lot more support out there than just even a couple of years ago, as people are getting diagnosed, as people are becoming aware, as people are going, oh, this is the reason why I never could make friends, or this is the reason why I've always struggled, or this is the reason why I've always loved this really obscure thing. Like I went to Oxford, and I'm still in touch with one of the people who was the porter. She worked in reception there, and she said to me she's convinced that the majority of people at Oxford are on the spectrum, because it's that obsessive way of thinking that makes us really, really dig deep into a subject, that gives you that academic excellence. So, and this again, we're talking about 20 years ago, and she was saying that she thought that the majority of people then were there. So we're lucky enough to be in a position where more of us are able to stick our hand up and go, yeah, actually, this is me. You read, it's particularly hard for women to get diagnosis, because it does manifest differently in women, but there's starting to be more resources out there. And you read resources about adult women autism, and you'll go, tick, 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 yeah, that's me. And once you've got that, it's up to you whether you want to go for the validation of a diagnosis or not. Because I wasn't going to, this is one of those wonderful twists of irony in the NHS for you. I have PTSD, and I got referred for EMDR, which is a treatment for PTSD. And when I was put on the waiting list for that, the woman who referred me said, I'll also put you on the waiting list for an autism diagnosis, because just in speaking to you, you clearly have autistic traits. And I don't know if EMDR will work on the autistic brain. So it'd be helpful to know if you're autistic. And the waiting list for autism is a year. Waiting list for EMDR is 18 months. You should be diagnosed before EMDR starts. Well, that was 2 years ago. I've been through my EMDR and the support from there, and I'm still waiting for a diagnosis. So I keep meaning to phone and chasing up. But now I'm kind of like, well, the reason for having it isn't there anymore, because it was all about seeing what therapy would work best for me. And turns out, yeah, EMDR doesn't work particularly well on me, because I do have a weird brain that doesn't work the way that most people's do. But, that's okay. We did other things instead. So, I come back to what I said earlier, which is labels are useful if they're useful. If it is useful to you to have that label, to look at those resources, to get that support, to build those networks, to get those connections, do it. If it's not, don't worry about it, because it's not going to change your reality. You are who you are. We're all just who we are. So in terms of neurotypical people, I've been really blessed in that the friends that I have who are neurotypical, I just seem to attract lovely people. So I'm very, very lucky, because my friends who are very clearly, normal people, whatever that means, are just really lovely sweethearts, and they're very inclusive. They're very understanding. And I think just, if you think that your child, I think I actually, my biggest thing would be to other parents of autistic children, because particularly when you get that first diagnosis, it can be a really scary thing because you don't know what your child's future is going to be like. You don't know how they're going to cope. You don't know how you're going to cope. There are all these, unknowns. And what I found worked best, just both from my experiences and just looking at the experiences of the other autistic parents that I know, is not to be afraid to be guided by your child. So for us, we home educated. We were planning on home educating anyway. And then when it became clear that our children were not suited to a school environment, what was a choice became a necessity. But we were lucky because that's what we were doing anyway. But I go to the youth club my oldest son went to. It was an autism youth club. And like other children there would come up to me and go, "Oh, Seth's home educated. Will you home educate me?" And I'd be like, "Yeah, no, can't do that. Sorry, dude." And you'd hear them say, "Well, yeah, and I've really struggled with school, but we've got a good school now." While their parents are in the other room talking about how hard it is to cope with their child. And I remember sitting with the parents at the youth club while the children were off, doing the do. And their worlds revolved around autism, and mine didn't. Mine happened to be just part of our makeup, but not the most important part, because we didn't do the things that didn't work for our children. I didn't force them to do activities that didn't suit them. We tried things. Sometimes they worked, sometimes they didn't. But I never forced my children to be something that they weren't, or got disappointed with them, because like my oldest, I couldn't wait to start going to the theatre with my children. I love the theatre. I wanted to take my oldest to pantomimes and musicals and plays. No, he hates them. He can't cope. It's too noisy. It's just too overwhelming. And part of me is really sad because he doesn't love the things that I love. But that is also part of parenting, that the children you get are not necessarily the children you dreamed of. And you might not share interests. And that's okay, because if he doesn't like going to the theatre, he likes other things. He gets equal pleasure out of different things. So it's not a case of he can't ever be happy or he can't ever have friends. He just likes different things to me. And that's true with any parent-child relationship. But I just would really, really, really be guided by your child. And that doesn't mean you let them do whatever they want, because autistic children, probably more than most, really need boundaries to know what is okay and what's not okay. But if you establish those boundaries with love and you communicate with your child in whatever way is most effective for your child, and you make the best possible choices that you can, because I know that home education is a privilege that not everybody can afford. I get that. But for us, it completely saved us, because if we had to put them into school, I couldn't have worked anyway, because I would have had a phone call every other day about at least one of the children. So no employer is going to keep me on when I'm having to go down to the school to deal with my children anyway. But yeah, so it's kind of accepting that you can't do some things, but just because you can't do some things doesn't mean that you can't do all the things. And there's actually a world of cool stuff out there. And now my oldest is 18. He has a ton of good friends. He actually hates using his autism for anything. I've always been like, Seth, get support at college, get this help. And he's like, I don't want it. God, I wish you'd stop waving the autism flag. He genuinely is like, no, I don't want to use it. It's not important to me. It doesn't make any difference to me. I can see where it does affect him, but I also respect that he just wants to be treated like any other person. And he is. And he's doing an animation course. He's planning on going to university to do animation, and he's going to be amazing. My oldest daughter is at art college. She's studying art because it's the one thing she's been, like I say, she traded all those disabilities for the art. But she's planning on going to university. She wants to be a comic book artist, and there are comic book degrees. So she already knows which university she wants to go to. She's going to go and study making comic books, learning about how to make it in the industry. And she's the most ridiculously sensible 16-year-old you will meet in your life. She has asked for a Hoover for her next birthday because she's going to university. She's a neat freak and she wants a Hoover to take with her to university. So that's my 16-year-old.
I love that.
But yeah, it's just about accepting the child that you have, knowing that they are amazingly awesome. And if you are experiencing challenging behaviors, there's going to be a logical reason for it. And it might not be obvious to you. You might struggle to figure out at first. But if you can step back, remove emotion from the relationship, then you'll be able to see where it's coming from and then build from there. Because, you know, my son wasn't completely nonverbal, but he didn't really speak an awful lot until he was about 5. And instead we had all this aggression to deal with. But we found out why that was and we worked with it. You know, we didn't beat it out of him. We channeled it in a different direction. So whatever you're experiencing, you're not alone. Reach out to other people, see what's worked for others and see what will work with your child. Because ultimately, you know, an autistic person is still a person. It's still all part of the human experience. So it's just about just having that sort of, you know, I have an old hippie soul, but it is about having that just, you know, tolerance, love and acceptance. And I think if you just give that, you can't really go much wrong.
I really appreciate you speaking with me and sharing all of this. I think it's so helpful in all ways for those that have their family members that are on the spectrum, for people that do not. Like it's in all ways a learning thing, and I really do appreciate you coming on and sharing that with me and everybody that's listening. Um, and I also wanted to talk about how you yourself, you're actually an author as well.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, you know, I'm like a lot of writers. I've been writing all my life, and like sort of one of my life goals was to become a published author. And a friend of mine, who I met through sort of a pagan discussion group, she set up a publishing company. And at the time we were having all these trolls coming onto the group claiming to like be real life Harry Potters being at real life Hogwarts, and it was just really boring and annoying. And she was setting up this company and we were like, right, well, somebody needs to write an actual book about being a wizard. So I was like, well, I'll write it if you publish it. And she was like, well, I'll publish it if you write it. And I'm like, are you sure? And she was like, are you sure? So I wrote this. It was very tongue-in-cheek, to be fair. It's not the same book that I would write now if I was to rewrite it. But there is also a lot of good stuff of it. And funny enough, actually, a couple of weeks ago, I actually had a private message from somebody who'd tracked me down on Facebook and wanted to let me know how much he'd appreciated the book. And it's like, it's a book that's now out of print. You know, she pulled it once she got more serious books on her shelves. But, you know, there's a lot of good stuff in there. And somebody, you know, reached out and said, like, I found it really valuable and really helpful. So that was like the first book that I ever wrote. And then while I had 3 children at the time, I didn't realize I was going to have 2 more quite soon after that. But I was looking for something to do that was, I could work around the children and bring in a bit of money. And I ended up setting up a publishing company, which I ran for a few years before I sold it. Because when I set it up, I wasn't expecting to have 2 more children and then returning to the UK by myself while my husband stayed back in New Zealand for 9 months and all that kind of stuff. So it was like, well, yeah, no. So I still, you know, wanted to bring in some money. So I started getting into freelance writing. And from there, then, you know, Amazon launched its self-publishing arm and stuff. And I had a few books published by a traditional publisher, which was a small independent press, which they've now shut down because the woman running it had a baby and they didn't want to do it anymore. So I started writing books about spiritual subjects that, I see that there is a need for things, because one of the things that I find most frustrating about sort of a lot of modern alternative spirituality systems is that a lot of it is derived from Wicca, which is an initiatory system at its core. And if you're not an initiate, you don't necessarily understand everything that you're doing. And Wicca has been set up in a very, very specific way to take you through the magical process with a very specific result. And when you take out pieces from that sort of wholesale without understanding their purpose and their effect, it can actually be quite dangerous. And what's even more frustrating, I find, is that it's not necessary, because there are actually other more effective ways that people can achieve the same purpose in a safer way that makes more sense for people working solitary, just wanting to build those connections. So I've started to write books that give people the choice of technique, basically, that says, right, if you want to be doing these things, here's how you can do it in a way that is meaningful, effective, but is specific to your personal preferences, skills, talents, background, So I have a book about tarot, which teaches you how to read the cards without actually having to learn the meanings. I have a course. I can teach people how to read tarot in an afternoon. I've done it with quite a few people that they've started not knowing anything about it. And by the end of the afternoon, they can do fluent readings for other people, say what all the cards mean, just because of the way that I teach. So I have a book that sort of accompanies that process, so people can develop their own relationship with the cards, because you get better readings when you're using your interpretations rather than somebody else's. I have a book about meditation. I'm just about to qualify as a chakra dance meditation teacher, which I'm really excited about because that's this week. And yeah, just sort of showing people, look, everybody can meditate. Don't care who you are. But I know a lot of people say that they can't because they've tried it. And what it will be is they've tried one or two particular methods. Those haven't worked for them because not all techniques work for all people. And then decided, that's it, I can't do it. Whereas maybe they needed to do a moving meditation. Maybe they need their body to engage to still the mind. And they don't know that's an option. So my meditation book gives you all that. And I co-wrote a book with a friend that I run spiritual retreats with about working with the elements. And again, it's very much about, if you want to build a relationship with earth, air, fire, water, here's how you can do it yourself. Here's some ideas to get you started. Here are some ways to connect. Here are some safe but effective techniques that will enable you to develop a personal relationship that you can then build on. And I've got a book that I'm currently writing about ritual, which again talks about like completely non-Wiccan ways of doing things. You might want to do it the Wiccan way, but do it from a place of choice and power and knowledge, not because, well, that's what all the books said to do, so I think I better do it that way. So it goes through a wide range of creating sacred space, all the different ways of what kind of rituals you might want to do, how you can write them, how you can raise power. So again, number of different ways of doing that, the different steps to an effective ritual, how you plan ritual. I've run workshops where we've taken a group of people that had never met before that workshop, sat them down, written a ritual together collaboratively in 10 minutes, and then performed the ritual. And it's been beautiful and really effective. And that's how I teach. I teach very much, it's the same approach that I take with my children. You meet the person where they're at and say to them, right, okay, here are your choices. Now go with the one that makes the most sense to you from a place of power and knowledge, rather than saying to somebody, right, you're going to do it my way because my way's the best.
Well, I definitely appreciate you sharing that. And where can they find these books that you have?
Well, shortly you'll be able to do it on my website, which I'm working on at the moment. It's not up just yet, but it will be up within the next couple of weeks. But otherwise, if you search for Thea Faye, it's Faye on Amazon, then you'll find my author page. The tarot book is called How to Read Tarot Without Memorizing Meanings. So if you do a search for that, that will come up as well, and then you can click on my author page and stuff. And people can look me up on Facebook as well. I'm always happy to friend new people and build network and talk about anything. I'll talk about autism, I'll talk about spirituality, I'll talk about whatever people want to talk about because it's cool. So people can get in touch however works for them.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that. And I just love your personality. I think you're so much fun, and so knowledgeable. Like, you have so much that really is, thank you so much. I really do appreciate it. So we were talking before we started recording that I do a affirmation section of the podcast. So basically, what I have people do that are listening, even if you want to partake as well, you pick a number between 1 and 3, and you pick this number before I read the affirmations, because I try to give it like that fake kind of thing, like, you have your number, and then here's this faded affirmation that came with that. So for those of you that resonate with number 1, your affirmation is, I create a safe and secure space for myself wherever I am. For those of you that chose number 2, your affirmation is, I give myself permission to do what is right for me. And for those of you that chose number 3, your affirmation is, I give myself space to grow and learn. And with that, you are loved, you are worthy, you are blessed, and I am proud of you. Until next time on the Brie Pod. Bye.